this was the situation 6 years ago. Here's Senator John Cornyn of Texas.
Earlier administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have struggled with how to reduce the case backlogs in the immigration courts. And unfortunately, Congress has never provided the full extent of immigration judges and support staff truly needed to eliminate the backlogs. As a result, backlogs continue to grow. From 129,000 cases in fiscal 1998 to a staggering 684,000 as of February 2018.
684,000 backlog cases. That's a lot. But as of the end of 2023, that backlog is now over 3 million cases.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 302nd episode of this listener-supported podcast. This is Congressional Dish, and I am your host, Jennifer Briney. And today we are going to talk about immigration and the border, which sounds exhausting because immigration has been such a huge part of this never-ending presidential campaign. And the big reason for that is obviously because Republicans have been obsessed with this issue. It was a constant talking point with damn near every speaker at the Republican National Convention, including, of course, the Republican nominee for president, Donald Trump.
We also have an illegal immigration crisis, and it's taking place right now as we sit here in this beautiful arena. It's a massive invasion at our southern border that has spread misery, crime, poverty, disease, and destruction to communities all across our land. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. At the heart of the Republican platform is our pledge to end this border nightmare and fully restore the sacred and sovereign borders of the United States of America, and we're going to do that on day one. I will end the illegal immigration crisis by closing our border and finishing the wall, most of which I've already built.
And now the Democrats, and actually it's not now, it's been going on the whole time because of the Republicans' obsession, but the Democrats and their now nominee for president, Kamala Harris, are making border and immigration promises too. Here's Kamala Harris accepting her anointment as the Democratic Party nominee at the Democratic National Convention.
And let me be clear. After decades in law enforcement, I know the importance of safety and security, especially at our border. Last year, Joe and I brought together Democrats and conservative Republicans to write the strongest border bill in decades. The Border Patrol endorsed it. But Donald Trump believes a border deal would hurt his campaign. So he ordered his allies in Congress to kill the deal. Well, I refuse to play politics with our security, and here is my pledge to you. As president, I will bring back the bipartisan border security bill that he killed, and I will sign it into law.
And so we've heard their promises. We've heard those promises repeated over and over again. But all of these promises are annoyingly sparse on details. But I know where to get the details. For the Republicans' plan, the House Republicans during this Congress passed H.R. 2 without a single Democratic Party member. H.R. 2 is essentially the Republican Party's immigration wet dream, and so today I'm going to give you all the juicy details. And as for the Democrats, I read the text of the bipartisan border security bill that Kamala Harris has promised to bring back too. And so today, for probably the first time, you're going to get details about these two plans so that you can compare and contrast what specifically they intend to do about our border and immigration problems. And if you appreciate me reading and outlining the 214-page Republican bill and the 292-page bipartisan Senate Border Act, in case you haven't done that math, that's over 500 pages of legislation. And if you appreciate not having to read that but still knowing the details, I'm asking you to please pay for this work, because we operate on the value for value funding model here. And I have to imagine that there is some value that you receive from having 500 pages of legislation read and summarized for you. Because I don't have a budget with millions of dollars like corporate media organizations do, and that never use that money to bother to do this work and give you the details. And I don't fund my work by selling your time and accepting advertising from corporate sponsors, because I don't want to serve corporations. Too many media outlets already do. I want you to be my most valued customer, not them. And I also don't have a large team of researchers and writers to help me produce the show with the information that I collect, like John Oliver or the Daily Show people have. It's me and Claire researching and organizing the information here at Congressional Dish. That's it. Just the two of us. Which is why we ask you to pay out of pocket for the value you receive from Congressional Dish. And just for some comparisons, like, you will pay $10 for a movie ticket, or you'll pay $15 for an Audible book. And so I'm not asking you to fund this whole project. What I'm asking you to do is voluntarily pay an amount that you feel is fair compared to the amount that you're required to pay for similar forms of information and entertainment. Because you are the producer of this show. And we even offer credits. These are real credits. We will vouch for you. But you can be a producer at any amount that you provide above zero. And you can also be an executive producer. Being an executive producer and getting a credit costs $535 per credit. But if you do that, then you get to be publicly named as an executive producer on an episode of your choice. And your credit moves that episode up the most valuable episodes list, which makes that episode more likely to be heard by people who are new to the Congressional Dish community, because we have 12 years of archives going back on this show. And so when I tell new people what to listen to, that's where I tell them to turn, because that is literally the most valuable episodes list, because executive producers have decided to pay for those. And you are also our marketing department, because quite frankly, we can't afford to have one. Although even if we did, the social media algorithms are rigged against political content right now. So, Meta literally announced that they won't allow content like ours to go viral. So we need you to share these episodes with your friends and family. And don't forget to tell them about the show notes, because the show notes are how you know you can trust us, because we don't require you to trust us. We give you sources for everything we say, and we give you every sound clip that we play. And if you think that's a valuable service, if you think this is something that this country needs, please pay something and share this podcast with as many people as you can. And thank you to all producers who have been helping us do this and keep us going for all these years. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, let's get into what you're paying for, which is the information about the two bills that are being supported by the Republicans and the Democrats. But before we get into their bills, we have to understand at least a broad outline of our current mess of an immigration system so that we can understand the changes that they're trying to make. And just to put a little disclaimer on this system is incredibly complicated. I'm giving you a giant overview of this. It's much more detailed. There's a lot more nuance, but we're keeping everything pretty big picture here, especially because neither of these bills became law, and so we don't have to get that into the details. But just to give you a broad overview of our current immigration system, when people want to come to the United States, the easiest path for someone who doesn't live here to come here and stay here legally is for U.S. citizens to petition to have their relatives, specifically their spouses, parents, siblings, and children, to be allowed to come and live here with them. Now, we have no limits on the number of people who can be admitted this way, and this is the only category with no annual limits. But that's not the only easy path. The other easy path is to be rich and to buy yourself an investor visa. So basically, rich people just have to have $1.8 million laying around that they can spend on a US-based business that employs at least 10 people, and then they're in. And we allow 140,000 rich people to come in this way every year. But every other path to legally staying in the United States longer than a tourist visa, every other path is a lot harder and takes a lot longer. So relatives of green card holders who are not citizens but are allowed to live here permanently, they can gain entry, but there are annual limits as to how many relatives of green card holders will allow. And so the wait times right now are averaging over 2 years long, and the annual limit for all kinds of family members for green card holders is currently 226,000. People can also legally live in the United States if they get employment visas. Now, these visas are generally for highly educated people who have a company who wants to bring that person specifically into the United States. And so, like, tomato pickers are not getting these visas. Right now, the State Department allows 140,000 people to get these types of permissions each year, which, I just want to note, is the same exact number of rich people that they allow to buy their way into this country each year. But for regular, non-rich working people without a family member or a business that wants to bring them in, their only legal path to living here is something called a diversity visa that can be issued to a maximum of only 55,000 people who want to live here legally each year. Now, these can be issued to people from countries that have sent fewer than 50,000 immigrants to the United States over the past 5 years. And so, in effect, because these countries have either a lot of relatives of green card holders or have a lot of rich people, like all those other visas I just told you about. But in effect, citizens from Canada, China, India, Mexico, and the UK are almost never eligible for these visas, as they are either large countries or neighbor countries with enough rich people or family members of Americans to put their entire country over the limit. But that list does change, and so right now, happy, normal, working people who happen to live in 18 countries are just straight up if they want to come and move to the United States legally. They just can't. But regardless, for the rest of the world, there are always more than 55,000 people who want these diversity visas, and so they are passed out via the so-called green card lottery system, which is exactly what it sounds like. Some computer randomly chooses these people's fates. And that's really it for people with relatively peaceful life circumstances who want to come and join our society here in the United States. The only other avenue to get into the United States is only open to desperate people who face some kind of existential danger in the country where they're currently living, and they have to prove it to get in. Because as a signatory to a United Nations agreement that was signed in 1967, and through current U.S. immigration law, the United States has legal obligations to provide protection to those who qualify as refugees. But here in the United States, we don't always call these people refugees. In fact, most of the time lately, we don't. Lately, they have been branded as so-called asylum seekers, but it's the same thing. If a person can prove that they qualify for asylum, if they are able to prove that they are in specific kinds of danger if they return from where they came, then they are legal immigrants. They are allowed to be here. And the process for applying requires them to come here and apply in person. Now, the lowest amount of asylum seekers that the patron saint of the Republican Party, Ronald Reagan, let in per year was about 67,000. George W. Bush actually set the limit at 70,000, but never actually allowed that many in. The most he ever let in was about 60,000 in 2008. Obama allowed and let in about 70,000 per year while in office, so you can kind of see where our averages have been. But then came President Trump. And the number of asylum seekers, people in need of a safe home, well, the amount of those people that we allowed in plummeted every year that he was in office. In 2019, he only allowed in 30,000, which was the lowest in my lifetime. And I do have to note that fewer were admitted in 2020 and 2021, but that was during COVID, so I don't think it's fair to judge this stat using those years. But when President Biden came in, he increased the limit to 125,000 asylum seekers who are allowed to be granted legal entry into the United States each year, which brings us back in line with the limits and admission rates that were last set by the Clinton administration in the 1990s. So this is hardly an amount that we are incapable of handling. The problem is that more people are showing up to apply in person because our law says they have to come and apply in person than we are capable of processing. Because we require every single one of these people to prove that they are in danger, that means they need to be evaluated one by a judge who's going to determine their fate. And that's not the only work that our immigration judges have on their plates. In addition to judging the cases of asylum seekers who want to live here legally, the judges also have to deal with the people who sneak over the border or overstay their visas or otherwise come here illegally and get caught. And we have approximately, according to the Pew Research Center, 11 million people living here illegally who, if caught, would need to be processed by these judges. Now, this sound clip is a few years old. This is from April 2018 during the Trump administration. But I read all of our important new laws for a living, and I know that nothing has legally changed since then. And so here is a clip that I played back in 2018 but has never come out of my brain. This is James McHenry, who at the time was the director of the Justice Department's Executive Office for Immigration Review, and who is right now the Chief Administrative Hearing Officer at the Justice Department. But here he is explaining to our Congress the immigration court process to our senators.
A typical immigration court proceeding has two stages or two parts. The first is a determination of removability. The Department of Homeland Security brings charges and allegations that an alien has violated the immigration laws. The immigration judge first has to determine whether that charge is sustained, and that will be based on the factual allegations that are brought. So the judge will make determinations on that. If there is a finding that the alien is removable, then the case proceeds to a second phase. If the judge finds the alien is not removable, then the case is terminated. At the second phase, the immigration judge gives the alien an opportunity to apply for any protection or relief from removal that he or she may be eligible for under the Immigration Nationality Act. This will involve the setting of a separate hearing at which the respondent may present evidence, they may present witnesses, they have the right to cross-examine witnesses brought by the department, and they will bring up whatever factual bases there is for their claim of relief or protection. At the end of that hearing, the immigration judge will assess the evidence, will assess the testimony, will look at the law, and will render a decision. The judge may either grant the application, in which case the respondent will get to remain in the United States. The judge may deny the application, but give the respondent an opportunity to voluntarily depart at their own expense and sometimes after paying a bond, or the immigration judge may order the alien removed.
And so you can see it's a whole process, and it's a lot of work. And the workload on our judicial system is increasing because after a super quiet time at the border during the Obama administration through about halfway through Trump's administration, since then there has been a huge increase in the number of humans showing up at our southern border who are either applying for asylum or sneaking in and getting caught. But contrary to popular Trumpian bullshit, the situation on the southern border has drastically improved this year. Now, it's true that the number of people showing up at the border was off the charts for most of the Biden administration. But this year, there has been a huge decline. So, for example, at its peak during the Biden administration during December of 2023, so less than a year ago, 249,741 people were either met or caught at the southern border by Border Patrol. But in August of 2024, just a few months ago, that number was down to 58,038, which is back to the lowest this century Obama's year's numbers. And some changes in administration policy do explain this. So via an executive order in June, President Biden basically stopped people from applying for asylum if they didn't go to specific locations at the border or if they used an app called CPB-1 to make an appointment before they arrive. Asylum seekers who didn't get the memo and who just present themselves to authorities when they arrive at the border wherever they arrive, well, they get deported via this shortcut system that isn't really authorized anywhere in law that I know of. And the Biden administration has, in fact, been sued for this policy, but it remains in effect for now. And there are thresholds for this new, harsher way of dealing with desperate people who don't have the app or who don't know where the proper border crossings are along the 2,000-mile-long border. These harsher deportation standards go into effect when there's more than 2,500 people who are arrested at the border per week, and the procedures go back to normal when the arrests drop below an average of 1,500 arrests per day for a week. But no matter the thresholds for quicker and possibly illegal fast deportations, and no matter what their qualifications are, if they're allowed to stay or not, each person who is encountered by Border Patrol needs to be judged. It needs to be determined whether they can stay or if they must go. And a problem with our current immigration processing system, one of the main problems, is that we simply don't have enough employees doing that work. We don't have enough judges doing that work. And so the people we have working for us simply can't handle the caseload. And we have known this. More importantly, Congress has known this for a very long time. So I produced an episode about illegal immigration, like I said before, in 2018. And so this was the situation 6 years ago. Here's Senator John Cornyn of Texas.
Earlier administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have struggled with how to reduce the case backlogs in the immigration courts. And unfortunately, Congress has never provided the full extent of immigration judges and support staff truly needed to eliminate the backlogs. As a result, backlogs continue to grow. From 129,000 cases in fiscal 1998 to a staggering 684,000 as of February 2018.
684,000 backlog cases. That's a lot. But as of the end of 2023, that backlog is now over 3 million cases. And so what happens when there's a backlog like that? Well, here's Senator John Cornyn of Texas again. And again, this was back in 2018 when the backlog was 1/5 of what it is today.
Aliens in removal proceedings sometimes wait for years before they ever appear before an immigration judge. For example, as of February 2018, courts in Colorado had the longest time for cases sitting on their docket, more than 1,000 days, almost 3 years. In my home state of Texas, the current wait is 884 days, almost 2.5 years.
And so it was clear back then, and it's clearer today, that a solution to this backlog is needed. And the solution's pretty clear. We need more judges, which means we need more courts and we need more processing staff so that if someone belongs here, they can quickly be processed and start their life. So they can start working and start paying taxes and start putting down roots and contributing fully to our society. And if someone doesn't belong here, we need more judges, we need more courts, we need more processing staff to get them the fuck out of here. Because what's happening now is that people are just here in the United States, whether they're supposed to be here or not, lingering in limbo for years while they wait for their court dates. And some of these people are living in 100% taxpayer-funded communities called prisons. And then some of these people are also living just amongst us for years in limbo. And so as I was reading the bills, the Republican immigration solution known as H.R. 2 and the bipartisan Senate bill, the number one question I had was, are they hiring an army of judges? Because that, for so many years, has been such a key bottleneck in our system. And for reference, back in 2018, when the backlog was 684,000 cases, here's the number of judges that the Department of Homeland Security was asking for. Here's Senator Mike Lee of Utah speaking to then Director of the Justice Department's Executive Office for Immigration Review, James McHenry.
I believe you recently testified in front of the House Judiciary Committee that it would take about 700 immigration judges in order to be able to address the backlog and address the current caseload. Is that correct?
Yeah, last fall, the president proposed adding additional immigration judges up to a number of 700. If we could get 700 on board, especially with our performance measures, we could complete over 450,000 cases a year. That would eviscerate the backlog.
So 700 would do it.
And as of the end of 2023, we had 682 immigration judges. 6 years later, and we still haven't hit that judge employment goal. And now we have 5 times the number of cases to get through. So we have to hire more judges. And so any changes to the rules for immigration or the court system, any of it, all of it, it doesn't matter if we can't get the wannabe immigrants through the process in a reasonable amount of time. And by reasonable, I mean weeks, not years. And so that, as I was reading these laws, was a key question for me. Who spotted that key bottleneck and fixes it first is the winner for me. Who hires the most judges and does it the quickest is the winner for me, because everything else doesn't really matter until that bottleneck is unclogged. We'll still be catching people and either releasing them to live in limbo for years, or we will be paying with our taxes to house, clothe, feed, and provide free healthcare for them in often private for-profit prisons. And so, because the Republican Party seems the most passionate or paranoid, depending on your perspective, about this issue, let's look at their bill first, H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act of 2023. H.R. 2 passed the House of Representatives on May 11th, 2023, just a few months into this Congress. This is one of the first bills that the House Republicans wrote, worked on, and passed, and they did so with a vote of 219 to 213. 0 Democrats voted for this, and only 2 Republicans, Tom Massey of Kentucky and John Duarte of Farm Country, California, voted no. And so this was a Republican bill. And it was broken into 2 sections. One section was entirely devoted to building a border wall along the 2,000-mile-long U.S.-Mexico border, and the second section was about immigration policy. And so let's start with the part of the bill that must have felt like a sweet caress on Donald Trump's ass, the border wall section. So first, the Republican bill would force the Secretary of Homeland Security to resume, quote, all activities, unquote, related to constructing a border wall between the U.S. and Mexico that was planned by the Trump administration. The border wall would have to be at least 900 miles long, and it would not include just a physical wall. There would also be surveillance towers and radars and seismic acoustic detection sensors, all kinds of expensive technology, and drones that would patrol the border no less than 24 hours a day. All kinds of money for the defense contractors. In addition to building the wall and spending all that money on giant multi-corporation products that will pass out shareholder profits, the Republicans also want Border Patrol to be staffed with at least 22,000 full-time Border Patrol agents. Right now, there are about 19,500 agents, and they would be equipped with radios that allow them to communicate with each other between ports of entry and with state and local law enforcement. And this part, at least, seems like a good idea that literally everyone agreed on. In addition to building a wall, the federal government would also be forced to kill all of the carrizo cane and salt cedar plants along the Rio Grande River. Now, we've talked about this before in one of the previous episodes, because the Republicans keep trying to do this, and it's because they don't want migrants to be able to find shade or to be able to hide in the plants. And so they want to kill all the plants. And apparently this would be accomplished by releasing a few million non-stinging wasps imported from France and Spain into the area. And the wasps' breeding habits apparently are deadly to these particular plants. And while this release the wasps plan is a little too Black Mirror for my taste, I must admit that it seems like a better plan than their original plan, which was to poison all the plants. The WASP's plan emerged after locals successfully sued to stop the plan to poison their neighborhoods and river. But I imagine that if I lived in these border towns, I might have some thoughts on the plan to release a few million wasps into my hood. Not to mention the construction of a giant wall and 24-hour mass surveillance technologies. And so, do the locals get any say in this? Well, the short answer is no. This bill, instead of guaranteeing individual property rights, would instead put limits on the rights of the pesky U.S. citizen locals. The Republican bill says that Homeland Security would have to, quote, consult, unquote, with people in state, tribal, and local governments and affected private property owners, but these consultations could not delay construction for more than 7 days. And then pairing that with the provision that says, quote, the Secretary of Homeland Security shall waive all legal requirements, unquote, that would stand in the way of building the wall, those consultations are almost assured to be useless, as anyone affected would be literally powerless to stop construction on their property. And so that is the first part of the bill. The second part of the bill relates to asylum seekers, to the refugees, who, if they can prove, have a danger that is posed to them in their home countries, or like certain kinds of dangers, they are legally allowed to be here. And so, for these human beings caught by Border Patrol, this Republican bill would make it illegal to process their asylum claims if they do not go to official ports of entry. Not during times of extreme numbers of migrants like President Biden is currently maybe illegally doing right now, but always. And so if a person who may or may not speak English or may not have a smartphone, who just walked through the desert, arrives and walks right up to Border Patrol and says, I am here and I would like to ask for asylum, if they didn't somehow magically know where a port of entry is, they're fucked. And I'm a U.S. citizen, and without internet access, I don't know where a port of entry is on the southern border. And now that I've looked it up, using ChatGPT, because this information is not easy to find using any kind of interactive map or anything intuitive like that. But thanks to the assistance of my $20 a month robot slave, I now know that there are 48 ports of entry. There's 6 in California, 8 in Arizona, 3 in New Mexico, and 31 along the 1,254-mile Texas-Mexico border. But that's an average of over 40 miles between ports of entry, which is kind of a lot for people arriving on foot. And so it seems cruel, to me at least, to tell these people that they can't apply for asylum because they arrived on the wrong spot on an imaginary line, which is all a border is. If they can find a U.S. official and present themselves, if they are clearly not trying to just sneak in and stay, what's the difference? On top of that, a person's asylum claim would also be determined by their transportation route in another way, because the Republican bill also wouldn't allow for claims of asylum from anyone who crossed through another country on their way to the United States and who failed to apply to live in that country first and then received an official denial in every single country they entered along the way. And considering the entire southern border is shared with Mexico, this essentially requires everyone who arrives to apply in Mexico first, without actually saying that they have to apply in Mexico first. And so if a person has a right to apply here for asylum based on their circumstances, if they feel like they would be safest and best able to contribute to American culture and life, why should they have to try and live in Mexico first? Although I will note that there is an exception for people who were forced by others into prostitution or a form of slavery and who couldn't apply in other countries because they were under the control of their abusers. But that means that all but the most desperate of people, everyone but literal sex or drug mule slaves, couldn't practically apply in the United States without trying to live in Mexico first, even if they don't want to or don't feel safer in Mexico. But even if the person has figured out the right spot on the imaginary line to arrive on, and if they found a way to arrive from the south without first entering or living in Mexico, as we know, people legally claiming asylum in the United States have to wait for years for their day in court, mainly because administrations and Congresses, staffed by both parties, have not prioritized hiring judges despite knowing that they are short judges for many years. Well, the migrants have friends and families and opportunities all over the United States. And the border towns will obviously struggle to house all the newcomers at these numbers. But the Republican bill would make it illegal for the U.S. government to fly them to be released in cities outside the southwest border. And so, if overrun border cities are a problem, as the Republicans say, denying poor people transportation seems like it would kind of force people to stay close to the southern border. It's kind of hard to absorb all these people if we can't spread them out. You know, this is why our governor here in Texas has been busing migrants to cities in the north. There is a logic behind what he's doing, even though he's doing it in cruel ways with no warning to the cities that he's sending people to. He's basically using human beings as political pawns. Greg Abbott is an asshole, but the asshole does have a point. And just to put this bullshit talking point to bed before you email me about it, it's already U.S. law that people who have posed any kind of danger to the United States or who have committed a serious crime in the past are not eligible for asylum. They are already immediately turned away at the border. We do not have a huge wave of criminals wandering around the United States waiting for their asylum court dates. But all of this is a problem because it's impossible right now for an asylum seeker to be processed at the border right away. The years-long wait because we don't have enough judges, that's still a problem. And so how many judges does the Republican bill require to be hired? 0. Instead of hiring an army of judges to be stationed at the border to process the claims quickly, the Republican bill instead would put up barriers to refugees having their claims considered at all. So who needs a court when you can just make it next to impossible to apply? So first, like I said before, people convicted of serious crimes are already prohibited from claiming asylum in the United States. But if the Republican bill were to become law, that would change in a way that would disqualify a lot more people. Because people would become ineligible for asylum not just for serious crimes, but for being convicted of any misdemeanor offense, including possessing, not even using, just possessing, an identification document that doesn't belong to them, or for receiving a public benefit that they weren't eligible for, or for misdemeanor domestic violence, which includes intimidation, quote, however slight, unquote, of someone that person has ever lived with, or for possessing drugs or even drug paraphernalia, although possession of less than 30 grams of marijuana for personal use would not make them ineligible, and a positive sign of Republicans coming around and being a lot more realistic about weed. But the new list of disqualifying offenses is long. There's a lot on it, but those caught my eye because they're definitely below the standards of serious crimes, or even crimes at all. Because, I'm allowed to carry my husband's passport or his driver's license in my purse while in the United States. That's not a crime at all, and yet it would disqualify a desperate person from claiming asylum in the United States. On top of that, the Republican bill would allow the Secretary of Homeland Security or Attorney General to add more disqualifying things to the list without a follow-on act from Congress being signed into law, and no court would be allowed to review or overrule any determinations or additions to the disqualification list made by the Attorney General or Secretary of Homeland Security. And I don't know about you, but I'm always uncomfortable with political appointees elected by no one being given any kind of power that is not reviewable by the courts. So basically, an administration that wants to make it damn near impossible, if not impossible, to qualify for asylum in the United States would have all the tools they need to do it if this bill were to become law. And that's just the qualifications for getting into a court to have a chance at asylum. If someone were to make it that far, the Republican bill would then allow the immigration judges to use any information they want to make their determinations, not just information that was admissible in court. And their cases would be much harder to prove to the judges because the Republican bill raises the standard for asylum seekers to be taken seriously. Because instead of them having to prove that they would have a, quote, significant possibility, unquote, of being persecuted wherever they came from, they would instead have to prove that it would be, quote, more likely than not, unquote, that they would be persecuted. Which means that would require the asylum seeker to provide some kind of proof to show that their claim is likely instead of possible, which, how do you prove that you were prostituted by force in your home country? How do you prove that you were locked in a prison cell in solitary confinement for 3 years because the government is currently run by a dictator who you didn't support? How do you prove that these things are likely? Proving it's possible is an achievable standard because you could say, there are people just like me that this has happened to. But likely? That's a higher and far more subjective standard. How do you determine probability of something like that? And I think the point is that many times you can't. And so basically, the Republican bill would put up hurdle after hurdle, location hurdles, eligibility hurdles, burden of proof hurdles to claiming asylum. And technically, they aren't taking away anyone's right to asylum, just like they don't technically take away a person's right to welfare benefits with hurdles, but the effect is the same. Fewer people getting what they have a right to. And so next time you hear elected Republicans talk about bureaucracy and how impossible it is to navigate, just remember this example of them making it impossible by design. This is what they do. We've seen it many times. But the making of life harder for asylum seekers, even the springy ones who get over the hurdles, it doesn't even end there. Because after someone is accepted into the United States, the way the system works is that from there, that person is protected from being returned to his or her home country and is authorized to work in the United States, is allowed to apply for a Social Security card, may request permission to travel overseas, and can ask the government to bring their families to the United States. A person granted asylum may also be eligible for certain government programs such as Medicaid or the Refugee Medical Assistance. And then after 1 year, that person is granted official asylum. They can apply for lawful permanent resident status, which means a green card. And once that person becomes a permanent resident, then they can apply for citizenship after 4 years. But the Republican bill would make it possible for a mean or racist administration to take away their authorization to work legally in the United States. Because instead of being guaranteed by law, their ability to work would instead be up to the Secretary of Homeland Security and would be determined by regulation, which we all know changes from administration to administration. And even if the Secretary of Homeland Security were to authorize refugees to work, they wouldn't be allowed to work legally for 6 months after filing their asylum application. Which I need to tell you, that 6-month waiting time, that's the law already. And it's been the law since the Republicans teamed up with the Clinton administration to make it law in 1996. And I don't understand it, because if someone shows up here with nothing, not allowing them to work for 6 months means that they have no choice but to live off of taxpayer money for a while. And so when a migrant is able to legally work, they are not only able to take care of themselves, but they also pay taxes. And so it's best for everyone that they be allowed to work while they're here, that they be allowed to contribute to the United States. But far from appealing that 6-month waiting period, the Republicans instead put up more hurdles. Because once a refugee is officially allowed to work, their work permit would only be authorized for 6 months at a time, meaning that they would have to reapply twice per year, and the government would be processing their paperwork over and over again for really no good reason. And each of these paperwork filings would also come with fees. And so a $50 fee would be required to apply for asylum. Then fees would be allowed to be charged for each application to work legally. And those fees are not limited. And so basically the Republican bill would allow a nasty immigrant-hating administration to cause asylum seekers who arrive with nothing to start their life in the United States in debt. And they are adding unnecessary paperwork burdens to an already overworked immigration processing workforce. It's laws like this that break the government, flooding employees with unnecessary paperwork just to make life harder on poor people. Republicans do this same type of shit with unemployment and food benefits and housing benefits. They seem to think that if they make the process a pain in the ass, people will just give up. You know, ideas like these don't make government work more efficiently or cost effectively. This is governmental sabotage. Sabotage of the government's efficiency and sabotage of the asylum seekers' chances of succeeding in this country. And it's fucking mean. And it's also mean to make money off of keeping innocent people in cages. And the Republican bill continues the mean streak by making it harder for people who are claiming asylum to be released from immigration prisons while they wait for their hearings, which once again, we know the line is years long because we don't have enough judges, with the Republicans hiring 0 in their bill. But back to the prisons. What the Republicans would do is limit the people eligible for parole and eligible to work while they wait for their immigration hearing to only those people who are married to or are the child of a person serving in the U.S. military or someone from Cuba for some reason, and who petitions for admission before arriving in the United States, which in the case of asylum seekers isn't even allowed. Asylum seekers have to apply in person, and so this would pretty much doom asylum seekers to immigrant prisons by default. The only avenue for parole into the United States would be for a person to attend their immigration hearing if they are waiting in Mexico or Canada. And in this case, they can come into the United States for their hearing, and then they must immediately get the fuck out. And so this bill almost certainly will result in more people being housed at our expense in immigrant prisons. And let's be crystal clear who benefits from this, because according to the American Civil Liberties Union, approximately 90% of caged immigrants are held in private, for-profit prisons in the United States, which is actually worse than it was in the Trump administration, who held approximately 80% of caged immigrants in for-profit prisons, which make billions of dollars, billions of our tax dollars, which then pass out tens of millions of our tax dollars every year to their shareholders. And so in their bill, first of all, the Republicans just want to cage more humans. It requires the Department of Homeland Security Secretary to imprison immigrants and asylum seekers who are only charged with misdemeanor offenses for, like, crossing in the wrong location and who entered the United States with a child. It is probably a good thing that the adult and the child are required to be detained together. But I don't know, because what if that guy's a trafficker with the child? Like, I don't know. I don't know what to think about that one. But to pull off the increase in caged humans, the Republican bill also requires the Department of Homeland Security Secretary to reopen all of the immigration prisons that were operational on the last day of the Trump administration. In other words, to reopen all the prisons that were closed by the Biden administration. And the bill lists 5 specific prisons that the Republicans want reopened. And I looked into every one of them. So, one of the prisons that the Republicans want reopened is the Irwin County Detention Center in Georgia, which was closed following widespread scrutiny over allegations of abuse, including claims of unwanted and unnecessary gynecological, as in look at my vagina procedures, performed on women detainees. These allegations prompted an 18-month Senate investigation which found that women were indeed subjected to unnecessary medical procedures, often without their consent. The Irwin County Detention Center is operated by the LaSalle Corrections Company, which is a private company, for-profit company, and it was closed as a part of the Biden administration's efforts to stop the abuses and mistreatment that were proven to have occurred there. Another prison that the Republicans want back in our system is the C. Carlos Carrero Immigration Detention Center in Bristol County, Massachusetts. And this is another prison where there were credible allegations of abuse of caged immigrants. A 2020 investigation by the Massachusetts Attorney General found that on May 1st, 2020, the Bristol County Sheriff used, quote, excessive and disproportionate, unquote, force on immigrants who refused to consent to COVID-19 testing and isolation. The methods to coerce them to comply with COVID testing and solitary confinement included the use of a flashbang grenade, anti-riot shields, and big scary dogs. They also used pepper ball launchers and pepper spray canisters and turned off the ventilation systems. So if this is all done in the name of COVID, turning off the ventilation systems doesn't make any sense. These findings led to a federal investigation into the facility, and after that investigation, the Department of Homeland Security decided to end its contract with the Bristol County Sheriff's Office, which oversaw the facility. Now, this isn't a private prison, but the sheriff in Bristol County is a prominent Trump supporter. During the Trump administration, Sheriff Thomas Hodgson was a frequent guest at the White House, and he was standing behind the former president during speeches about immigration and law enforcement. And at home in Massachusetts, Hodgson was one of Trump's most prominent supporters. He chaired the former president's re-election committee and once offered to send inmates from his county jail to the Mexican border to construct Trump's precious border wall. The third prison that the Republicans want to bring back is the Etowah County Detention Center in Gadsden, Alabama. Now, this facility was a county jail meant for short-term detainment, which was closed by the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement due to long-standing concerns about the facility's conditions. Basically, the jail was old, had inadequate health care, and the lack of outdoor space were of particular concern. Inspections failed at the facility multiple times. And so while the jail still exists, ICE hasn't been housing immigrants there since about the spring of 2022. And I couldn't find any specific reason why the Republicans would want to make this an ICE facility again, other than the member of Congress who represents the district that the jail is in Representative Robert Aderholt, he blamed the closing on the Biden administration as opposed to the shitty conditions of the jail and the inappropriateness of it serving as long-term housing. And so it wouldn't surprise me if Representative Aderholt had something to do with this, but I don't actually know if that's the case. The fourth prison the Republicans want to bring back is the Glades County Detention Center in Moorhaven, Florida. And this is another prison owned and operated by the local sheriff's office that apparently had shitty conditions within the facility. There were 15 civil rights complaints filed during the Biden administration alone against this facility. Among the abuses rampant at Glades, immigrants had been subject to racist abuse, often resulting in verbal abuse and violence. They had been subjected to sexual abuse, including guards who watched women shower. There was a near-fatal carbon monoxide leak, and there was regular exposure to highly dangerous levels of a toxic disinfectant chemical spray. There was a group of 17 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, led by Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz from Florida, who urged the Biden administration to shut down this prison, and they did in 2022. And this seems like a good time to tell you that while requiring these prisons that have already proven themselves to be dangerous to be reopened, the Republican bill also prohibits states from requiring license from immigrant prisons that house children. So this is how much they care about the conditions, and they wouldn't require licensing for children's facilities. What could go wrong? And then finally, the Republicans want to bring back the South Texas Family Residential Center, which is a CoreCivic private for-profit prison and is the largest immigrant prison in the United States, which as of June of this year was profiting from caging approximately 1,800 people, most of whom were women with no criminal records. CoreCivic is one of the two largest private prison companies that cages humans for profit and funnels millions of our tax dollars per year to the shareholder class. And when this bill was written, the Biden administration was considering transforming the South Texas Family Residential Center into a rapid processing hub, with the goal being to screen migrant parents and children and being able to release them into the United States within 72 hours instead of caging them indefinitely. But since then, Immigration and Customs Enforcement decided to just shut the prison down, saying that this massive for-profit prison is, quote, the most expensive facility in the national detention network, unquote, and that taxpayers could save $129 million per year if they were not to use it anymore. And so the Republican bill orders the DHS secretary to, quote, take all necessary steps to modify and operate the South Texas Family Residential Center in the same manner and capacity it was operating on January 20th, 2021, unquote, which is the day Trump left office, which means the Republicans want this tax money wasting private prison to be reopened and specifically caging humans for profit again. And so remember that next time Republicans talk about being fiscally responsible or concerned about wastes of taxpayer money. They have no problem with wastes of taxpayer money when that money gets funneled to the shareholder class and to themselves, because CoreCivic has some generous Republican donors. For the 2024 election, people affiliated with CoreCivic have passed out an average of $3,000 to Republican members of Congress to help with their reelection campaigns, while only giving $184 to Democrats. And you can see in this bill what those legal bribes buy. And finishing up the prison part of the bill, if the Department of Homeland Security Secretary couldn't find a prison bed for a person, the bill would require the immigrant to be sent to Mexico or Canada, regardless of if they crossed the border legally or illegally. And it allows the attorney generals of border states to sue the Department of Homeland Security Secretary if they believe that he or she is not sending immigrants to Mexico or Canada as required. And then finally, when it comes to children, this Republican bill would have required the Department of Homeland Security Secretary to return unaccompanied children back to their home countries if they're not trafficking victims and do not have a fear of return. Current law gives the Department of Homeland Security Secretary that option, but only if the child is from Canada or Mexico. This bill would also authorize the immigration officers to withdraw a child's application to be admitted into the United States, regardless of the child's ability or desire to do so. I mean, they came here for a reason. The bill would also require the DHS to collect information, so name, social security number, date of birth, that type of stuff, of people who would be taking custody of immigrant children. Seems like a good idea. And within 30 days of receiving that information, if they determine that individual is not legally in the United States, they must initiate removal proceedings. Uh-oh. This is a disincentive for people to take in these children because they could get deported themselves. And then to make it even more brutal, this would change the law so that these people would only have access to lawyers instead of what the law is now, which requires them having lawyers to represent them. Having a thing and having an access to a thing are very different things. And so how's that for protecting children? By limiting the amount of people that would be willing to take them in because they'd be jeopardizing their own immigration status in the United States. I mean, the cruelty of this is just, it boggles my mind. And it gets worse because right now there's a visa that can allow children to stay in the United States. It's called a special immigrant juvenile visa. And that's granted if a child has been abused by a parent. The Republican bill would disqualify any child who can be returned to a parent in their home country. And so basically, the Republicans want to change the law to require the child to be returned to a home where there's a known to be abusive parent as long as the other one is not abusive. Unbelievable. And then finally, they put penalties, like financial penalties, on people who overstay their visas. So that's what the Republicans want. So when you hear them say immigration, when you hear them say border, that's specifically what they want to do. So now let's compare that bill, the Republican wet dream bill, to the compromise bill that was written in the Senate by Republican James Lankford of Oklahoma, Democrat Chris Murphy of Connecticut, and Independent Kristen Sinema of Arizona. And if that explanation of H.R. 2 felt very long and painful to you, it did to me too, but don't worry, this one won't be as long because this was a much more straightforward bill. But there are a few bill votes that are referred to as the bipartisan border legislation, and so I do want to explain to you which one you're going to learn about today. Because one version was dingleberried onto a war funding bill in an attempt to get Republicans to send more money to Ukraine and Israel and to other places. But that's not the version that I read. And the two versions were a little different. So, for example, there were provisions about sanctions and money laundering in the dingleberry version that weren't in the version that I'm reading for you today. But I chose to read the standalone version, and I did so for two reasons. One, I want you to be able to use this vote, if you want to judge the job performance of your senator. And the packages don't let you do that. In a package of bills, you don't know if a no vote is because of the border legislation or for the war money. And if it's for the war money, is it for Ukraine or Israel or Taiwan or whatever else they slopped into the package? Like, we know that the TikTok ban, or not a TikTok ban because it was so much bigger than TikTok, but that was what was in the package of bills that inevitably became law. And so there's a bunch of shit that they put in there, and it's really hard to judge your senators based on those packages. But also, the majority of the yes votes on this version of the bipartisan border legislation were Democrats. There was only one Republican, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who voted for it. And so even though this bill was used as a political game, the votes really don't reflect the opinions of the Republicans, I think, on the details. The truth is that I don't really give a shit about their political calculations. Inside the halls of Congress, they are meant to be legislators, not candidates. Those are two completely different jobs. And the Republicans en masse, with the exception of Lisa Murkowski, they voted against the bill. And in this arena, in the governing arena, those votes matter. Those votes count. And so this is what the Democrats voted for, and the Republicans voted against, reportedly at the direction of their master, Donald Trump, who didn't want to give the Democrats a win before the election. That shows you how much they care about this issue. And they did this even though the details were largely written by a very conservative Republican, Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma, who also voted against it like the good little party loyal sheep that he is and always has been. But this will also be informative on the presidential vote level, because this is what Kamala Harris is promising to sign if we elect her president. And so even though this isn't the Democrats' wet dream bill, This is a compromise. It was written in large part by a Republican. But this would be law if the Democrats had their way. And so let's take a look at it and compare it with what I just told you about, which was the Republicans' wet dream. So specifically, the bill that we're talking about right now is S4361, the bipartisan, quote, Border Act, unquote. And so first, let's start with what's not in here, starting with Trump's 900-mile-long border wall. However, the bipartisan border bill would have provided over $2 billion for border security, including many of the same expensive and profitable tech gadgets. So like the drones, the surveillance towers, video cameras, communications, tunnel detection devices, all that shit that the Republicans wanted. It's all in here. The bipartisan bill would also have provided money to hire about 200 more Border Patrol agents, which would have brought our total up to about 19,700, which is fewer than the 22,000 that the Republicans wanted to fund. The bipartisan bill also doesn't fund the army of wasps, which were meant to kill all of the plants that provide shade along the Rio Grande. And the bipartisan bill doesn't force the reopening of expensive and abusive public and private prisons. Instead, the bipartisan Senate bill would have thrown billions of dollars at the problem, roughly $20 billion, which would have provided about $6.3 billion to the Border Patrol, which is one of the reasons the Border Patrol endorsed this bill. It also would have given $6 billion to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Now, about $2.5 billion of that would have been for increases in deportations. About $1.6 billion of it would have been for prisons, because the goal in this bill would have been for ICE to be able to detain 46,500 humans at all times. This bill also would have provided $1.2 billion for services to at least help these people navigate our immigration and asylum system, and to help people leave the country if they were denied their visas. This would have also provided almost $500 million to hire more ICE agents. The goal would have been to hire 800 more agents. And this included $200 million for counter fentanyl investigations. And there's actually quite a bit about fentanyl in both these bills, but I'm leaving that aside because that's a totally different thing. There was also $4 billion in here for U.S. citizenship and immigration services, specifically going towards hiring more staff. So like I said, one of the biggest problems we're having in our system is there's just not enough employees. This bill would have really done something about it. And then there was also over $1 billion for the State Department, and that was split between humanitarian needs in the Western Hemisphere. The idea would be to reduce migration in the first place, because the idea is that if people's home countries are less dangerous, then people wouldn't want to come here as often. And then this also would have included $230 million to pay other countries to accept the deported individuals. And I am very pleased to tell you that this would have provided $440 million, most of which would have been spent on immigration judge teams, which would include not only judges, but lawyers and court administrators and staff and court costs. And like I said earlier, this was the number one thing I was looking for, because it is critical that we get more judges, and we've known this for years. And so that alone makes me want this bill over the Republican one, because it actually does something that we need. In addition to actually hiring the judges that we need, the bill also expands the number of Border Patrol and ICE officers authorized to issue a notice to appear, which would reduce the workload of the judges. And it would allow protection determination proceedings to take place in any federally owned or leased building that is not property owned, leased, or managed by ICE or Border Patrol, and is a, quote, reasonable distance, unquote, from the migrant's current residence. So that would expand the locations where the cases can be heard beyond the already too crowded court buildings. And so this is all about getting rid of that backlog. It's all about hiring the employees that we need to get rid of that backlog. And this alone makes this bill just infinitely smarter than what the Republicans were trying to do in the House. And the hiring doesn't stop there, because the bipartisan Senate bill would have for 5 years given the Secretary of Homeland Security the authority to appoint people to positions within the Refugee Asylum and International Operations Directorate, the Field Operations Directorate, and the Service Center Operations Directorate of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, if the Secretary determined that a critical hiring needs existed. For 5 years, it would also allow the DHS secretary to appoint ICE officers, so the immigration officers, if the secretary determined that there was a need. And it would provide a permanent authority. So those other ones were only for 5 years. This would be a permanent authority for the DHS secretary to rehire former employees to any position at Immigration, Border Patrol, or Citizenship and Immigration Services. This bill would also make it easier for current law enforcement officers and members of the military to be hired as Border Patrol agents, and that would be valid until September 2027. Would also give asylum officers a 15% pay raise, which gives an incentive for people to actually want to be one. And to make sure that these new hires, and old hires for that matter, are doing their jobs well, the bipartisan Senate bill would also have required annual training for Border Patrol officers about the law, de-escalation techniques, and migrant and agent safety measures. The bipartisan compromise bill also made some changes to the asylum system, but the strategy is completely different from what the Republicans were doing in the House. It's not a strategy based on putting up as many cruel hurdles to seeking asylum as possible. Instead, the bipartisan Senate bill aims for faster deportations for people who don't qualify or follow the proper process, and faster releases from taxpayer-funded prisons for those who have a chance to stay. So in the faster deportation category, failure to file an application on time would result in an order of removal. So 14 days, you have to apply for asylum, and if you don't do that, you're gone. It also adds disqualifications for some asylum seekers, which is that if the person can avoid persecution by moving somewhere else within their home country, or if they could safely move within the country where they last lived, they can't stay here. And that's the only new hurdle. That wasn't the Republican bill, but that's the only one. There is also a change that essentially lowers the bar for proving that they have a credible fear of persecution wherever they came from proving that they face what current law says, a, quote, significant possibility, unquote, of being persecuted, to instead a, quote, reasonable possibility, unquote. Now remember, the Republicans in the House wanted to force asylum seekers to prove that they would, quote, more likely than not, unquote, be persecuted, which is super difficult, if not impossible thing to prove. And so this would make it a little bit easier for the people that say that they're desperate to hit that burden of proof. Now, for the migrants who are able to make enough of a case to warrant a day in court and are allowed to temporarily stay while they wait for their court date, those migrants would be issued an employment authorization, and that migrant could not be forcibly removed from the United States before going through their interview process, which is smarter than forcing them not to work for 6 months like current law and the Republicans prefer, during which we are almost certainly going to have to provide everything for them. And then after their court date, so these are the migrants who are not granted asylum, they would be issued removal orders, quote, without hearing or review, unquote. However, there would be a bit of a appeal process. So they would be allowed to request a reconsideration from Immigration and Customs Enforcement within 5 days of their determination. And that would be granted or denied based on the Immigration and Citizenship's director alone. So that person's decision would be final within the ICE process. But that migrant would also be allowed to request an administrative review by a protection appellate board, and that review would have to be completed within 72 hours of the request. And so if the appellate board then also determines that the migrant should be denied asylum, then that decision is like final. And that would all take place within a week. So it would be a very quick process. And so if that migrant is denied in all three of their opportunities, so at court, in the ICE appeal, and then the Protection Appellate Board appeal, then that person would be inadmissible to the United States and they would have to be removed within 90 days. And those migrants could be sent to a country where either they're a citizen or to the country of the migrant's last residence. And it does say that the migrants who have children would be removed with their children. The children would not be allowed to stay. The migrants who would be denied asylum and who want to then depart voluntarily to a location of their choice. So let's say they don't want to go to those two places. Well, they could do that. But the way it would work is that they would be required to post a bond. So they would have to give the United States money, and that money would be returned to them after they provide proof that they've left the United States. If the migrant can't afford to leave on their own, the Department of Homeland Security would be allowed to pay for the migrant's flights. And any migrant who doesn't leave would be fined between $1,000 and $5,000 and would be denied another asylum chance for the next 10 years. as for the large number of migrants who seem to arrive into the United States in waves, well, this bill would have created some emergency powers also for dealing with that, essentially legalizing what the Democratic President Joe Biden is doing and being sued for right now. And so in the bipartisan compromise from the Senate, the process it sets up says that for 3 years, the Secretary of Homeland Security would be given the authority, quote, in the Secretary's sole and unreviewable discretion, unquote. So this is a power expansion to declare a border emergency and remove any migrant who doesn't have predetermined permission to enter the United States or who doesn't present themselves at a port of entry in accordance with a process approved by the DHS secretary. So again, it's all about like where you arrive on the imaginary line. But during a border emergency, the DHS must still be able to process at least 1,400 asylum seekers across all of those ports of entry. So if the asylum seekers can find those, there is still a process available to them. But during the border emergency, migrants who don't show up at the port of entry will be immediately returned to the country where they're either a citizen or the country where they last lived. This does not apply to unaccompanied minor children or if the person is demonstrating a, quote, reasonable possibility, unquote, of being tortured if they return. If they can show that, then they'll be granted a temporary work permit while they wait for their court proceeding. Also, no court would be able to hear a migrant's case against the asylum officer's decisions. So also, I'm just very uncomfortable with courts and never being allowed to be involved in stuff like this. So here's another example. And then any migrant who has been removed twice during 1 year during a border administration would be automatically inadmissible for 1 year beginning on the date of their most recent removal. And then this also sets a bunch of thresholds, and they're very similar to the emergency thresholds that I told you about in the current emergency situation that Biden has already declared. It's a very similar process. And then finally, one of the things that the bipartisan Senate bill does that the Republicans didn't do is allows a little bit more legal immigration. And it's like a little bit, but it does set up a little more wiggle room for people who want to come here legally. So first, it sets up a special process to more easily admit no more than 10,000 refugees who worked with the United States from Afghanistan, because there's a lot of people who risked their lives to work with us, and then the Taliban was pretty much allowed to just take over Afghanistan again, and then the people who worked with us were left there to die. So yeah, we'll allow in 10,000 of them. That's nice of us. This bill would also allow the spouse, fiance, or child of an admitted migrant to join them in the United States and receive employment authorizations. The Senate bill would also increase the number of visas for family members that would be issued in the years 2025 through 2029. So it would be 512,000 instead of 480,000, which is it's a 6% increase. Like I said, this isn't a big deal. And the Senate bill would also make it easier for relatives of legal migrants to visit if the migrant promises in writing to provide financial support for their visitor for the entire length of their stay, if their visitor has obtained short-term health insurance, and if they declare their visitor's intent to leave at the end of their stay. And anyone who overstays their visa would not be allowed to return in the future. And so that's the Senate bill. It's actually much more straightforward. And now you know the differences in policies that are being offered by Republicans and Democrats when they use the terms border and immigration. That's specifically in legislation what they're trying to do. And so I hope this helped you understand the difference. All right, so before I sign off today, I do have a few things that I want to tell you. 3, really. The first step, of course, is I would like to thank our new executive producer. And this one I am very, very excited to announce for you. Because Tom Merritt, who is the host of the Daily Tech News Show, he is one of the most professional, impressive podcasters I've ever met in my entire life. This guy does a show every single day. He is so smart. He's a friend of mine at this point. He was on our live show for We're Not Wrong in Chicago. He joined us out there. I got to spend some time with him. He is a lovely, wonderful human being who I respect so much. And so it means so much to me that he is a supporter of my work. It makes some of my imposter syndrome go away. So he has stepped up and he is now an executive producer on episode 300, The Right to Repair. And I love this so much. I mean, the episode, if we're being honest here, was really Tom's idea because he wanted me to come on Daily Tech News, which I did, to talk about right to repair, but that sent me all the way down the rabbit hole. And so I watched a hearing and I told you all about it. And I just did it because I enjoyed it, right? But I did right by Tom. And so I'm so proud to be sharing the byline on that episode with Tom Merritt. And so thank you so much for the support, Tom. And it means more to me than you could possibly know to have someone like you respect the work that I do. Speaking of people that I respect in the podcasting space, I am so excited to tell you that my friend and fellow co-host on We're Not Wrong, Andrew Heaton, has finished a project that he's been working on for years, and I am so proud of him. He has published another book. He's a multi-time author, but this one is right up our alley because one of the things that I love so much about working with Andrew is that even though we see the world in a different way, he's not a tribalist. So when he hears a good idea, it doesn't matter who it comes from. He thinks about the actual idea or the actual policy and then makes his judgment coming from his own worldview and the way that he sees things and the education that he has. But he's not tribalist. Like, he doesn't support something because it's a Republican bill or because it's a Democratic bill. He's an independent thinker, and I absolutely love that. And so he just published this book. It's called Tribalism is Dumb, Where It Came From, How It Got So Bad, and What to Do About It. And I'm so proud of him. And so just to let you know, like, Andrew Heaton is many, many things. He's a political commentator. He's a historian for sure, but he's also a comedian. And so let me just read you the blurb on this book because there's no way this book isn't going to be funny. Even the blurb is funny. So it says, quote, "Tribalism has made politics so awful I was forced to write a book about it. Well, fine. This book explores the evolutionary roots of loving our team and hating the enemy team, and why groupish caveman instincts linger in our minds today. It answers, if tribalism is hardwired into us, what changed in the last 20 years? How did partisanship get so loud, toxic, and obnoxious and ruin last Thanksgiving? Finally, it says what we can do about it as individuals navigating relationships and as society as a whole. Tribalism is Dumb will make you less flummoxed about partisanship, political loudmouths, and dogmatic pundits. It will make you taller, slimmer, and more attractive to everyone you can legally hit on. And it will make you better equipped to navigate tribalism in the wild," unquote. I'm telling you guys, after touring with this man all over the country with We're Not Wrong in the last couple of years, I can tell you that he's just naturally witty. It just comes to him. And so I know this is going to be a funny book. And so while you can buy it on Amazon, and I've given you the link to that, I personally have bought the Audible audiobook because he narrated it himself. And so we already know he's an amazing podcaster, but I can promise you, I've seen it up close in person now so many times. He's also an amazing performer. And so the fact that he's performing this himself, I'm very excited to listen to this book. So yeah, I put that in the show notes for you. Go check it out, especially if you're a We're Not Wrong fan. That is a must buy. And then finally, I do want to tell you about one more thing, and this is absolutely nothing to do with Congress, but I did something over the weekend that I just want to share with you because it was wonderful. So one of the questions that I have gotten for 12 years now is, how do I do this job and stay sane? And for a very long time, I didn't know how to answer that question because I really don't think I did a very good job with the staying sane part, especially after 2017, after President Trump became President Trump. And I swear to God, it felt like this entire country lost its mind. And I think we're still in that era. If anything, things feel like they're getting crazier. And so this year in particular, I've been working very hard on taking care of myself and just finding a balance so that I can do this job long term. And because I don't think it's any secret that I've had times where I've just thought about not doing this anymore. But one of the things that I think is going to help me continue Congressional Dish long into the future is the fact that I have found something that I love to do outside of Congressional Dish, something I am obsessed with and that is very healthy for me, and that is beach volleyball. Now, I've always loved the game of volleyball, but I stopped playing a long time ago. You know, my social life was, this is very typical. I know that I've talked before about the fact that I quit drinking about 2 years ago. My 2-year anniversary will actually be on Election Day. But I was never an alcoholic. I was never someone that drank every day. In fact, when I quit drinking, a lot of people are surprised because I'm not the picture of a person that you think has a drinking problem. As my husband says it, like, I was never that alcoholic that drinks every day, but when I did drink, I went 0 to 60. Like, that was kind of my vibe. Like, it was a party monster. And that was actually quite fun. I don't enjoy it anymore, and I don't want to poison myself for fun. And so I had to find something else to do for my social life. And so sand volleyball, what that has given me is not only a social life, but a social life where exercising is central to it. And that's been really helpful because there's just study after study after study that shows that mental health is greatly improved with a lot of exercise. So the fact that those two activities, my social life and my exercise, are one and the same has been huge for me this year. And I've never felt more mentally healthy despite this year being very frustrating. I mean, this Congress is the worst I've ever seen. They got very little done. It was so partisan and so toxic. And of course, we all know that what Israel is doing in Gaza and now Lebanon, I still have trouble sleeping all the time. So it's like, this has been one of the mentally toughest years. And yet I've never felt more capable of dealing with it. And that is because I am an athlete again. I am playing sports all the time. And this particular sport is one that I know that I can do long term. I know that with this particular sport being on the sand, it's easy on my knees, it's easy on my joints. Like, this is something that I can keep playing into my 80s or 90s if I take care of myself. And so this is why I'm like so happy to have found this. And so one of the reasons that I want to tell you about this is that over this last weekend, I did a 3-day training camp with a company called Better at Beach. Now, I was really nervous to do this because the coaches are AVP pro beach volleyball players. In fact, I've seen them play in AVP tournaments. And so I thought it was going to be kind of out of my league. I was super nervous about it, but it turned out that it wasn't out of my league at all. So when I walked into the camp, I knew the basics, like I can pass a ball, I can serve over the net, I don't really know how to set, and I can't hit for shit. So it was like, I know the basics, but I wasn't good. And so I thought everyone would be above me, but there's different skill levels, right? So at the bottom is recreational, then there's B-, B, double B, and then it goes up into the A's, and then the open players are the best ones. And I'm a B-. I'm not recreational. I can do the basics, but I'm no higher than that. And this camp was specifically for people that were B and double B. So I thought that this wasn't going to be a good camp for me, but it absolutely was. In fact, there were people that were in this camp that were not able to serve over the net, that had never set a ball before. All of our hitting was a mess. So it was definitely it was actually really good for beginners. And I feel like I learned so many skills over the last 3 days. And I had played volleyball in high school. That's how I knew how to serve and pass, because those two skills in particular move over from indoor to outdoor really well. But my husband has never played volleyball before about a year ago. And so his improvement was dramatic over the course of 3 days. Now, I'm not going to lie, they kicked our ass. It was 8 hours, and 6 hours. And we had a reasonable amount of breaks and water breaks. I never felt like it was too much for me, but it was definitely a lot of exercise. We were definitely really tired. But I feel like I know so much more, and I'm so much more excited to get out onto the court now, because now I know where I'm supposed to be on the court. That was super confusing to me. And I learned everything I needed over the course of 3 days to give me a great foundation for this game. And what's even better is with these camps, you're meeting people in your community that also play beach volleyball, which is really important because this is one of those sports that you can't just do on your own. I was running from 2018 until, I still do. But when I picked up running, that was something I could just put on my shoes and go. And so that was helping me a lot mentally. That was the exercise that I was committing to. And I'm switching gears now. But the problem with sand volleyball is you need other people. And so this helps you find the community. What's great about these camps, they're based in Hermosa Beach, but right now I'm living in Austin, Texas. And so they are traveling all over the country and doing these camps. And so if you're someone who's interested in starting this sport, Looking at their calendar right now, I know that they're coming to Miami, Florida, Loveland, Ohio, Virginia Beach, Long Island, New York, Scottsdale, Arizona, Tacoma, Washington, and Ozark, Missouri. And I do know they have a few spots available for their vacation style camp in Punta Cana, Mexico. And so most of the camps, the ones that are 3 days, are the ones like I did. And you are going to be learning the entire time. Like it's training the whole time. Where the vacation ones, the ones that are like a week long, they also have a 10-day thing. That's going to be some training in the morning and then a lot of games. And then people go out to dinner and go party. And that's more of like a vacation camp. So they have different things. And then they do trainings almost every day of the week in Hermosa Beach, California. But I was just so impressed by this entire thing. And by doing this camp, I feel like I'm going to start traveling to some of the longer camps that they have, the week-long camps, because what they were saying was once you go to those, you'll make friends that play sand volleyball all over the country, if not the world. And as a digital nomad, I absolutely want to have volleyball friends in as many locations as I possibly can. But one of the reasons I wanted to tell you about this is if they are coming anywhere near where you live, Miami, Loveland, Virginia Beach, Long Island, Scottsdale, Tacoma, Ozarks, and they add more of these all the time. If you are looking for an amazing sport that gives you, it's just so much fun. Like that's what I love about it. But this is how you can find your community. That's the hardest part about starting beach volleyball is finding your community. And this is a way to do it. So I've put a link for this in the show notes for you. It's called betteratbeach.com. Check it out. See if this is something you might be interested in if you've ever been interested in this sport, because I think it is the best way I can possibly think of in a very short amount of time to get the skills you need to go out and play anytime you want to. So, yeah. Now that's all I wanted to tell you about. As for Congressional Dish, I don't know if there's going to be another episode before the election. I feel like I've told you everything I need to tell you to prepare you to vote. You have all the votes and the links that you need in the show notes. So I feel like my job is done. I might have another episode for you, but I do have to go to a funeral. It's not actually a funeral of anyone I know. One of my friends, her father passed away, so I'm going to go and support her. But I think that's it for the 118th Congress before we vote. I know there's been some really interesting hearings. I'm going to get back to working on that, but I think there's nothing else I can do for you. So if you got value from this, please support the show. I will tell you, if you've made it this long, I'll open the kimono a little bit here. I was looking at the stats for Congressional Dish and the money. We have been flat. We have been plateaued now for a year and a half, which I guess is better than going down. We did lose some money and some listeners during the Israel-Palestine episodes, but that's just how it was going to go. So we've regained some of that ground, but the show is not growing. I don't know why. So anything you can do to help would be very much appreciated, because even though I think we're sustainable right now, I feel like we should be growing. And yeah, I wish we were. So that's about it. Happy voting. And one last thing. I'm going to be doing Justin Robert Young's Politics Election Night special on election night. And I know everyone's doing an election night special, but if you like the three of us, we're going to be together on camera. You should go to Justin Robert Young's Twitter to find out the information about that. He usually puts that out on Twitch, maybe YouTube. I don't know. I just show up. But if you want to do election night with me and get my immediate reactions, I'll be on the air on Tuesday night, and then we'll be recording We're Not Wrong on Wednesday. But no matter who wins this, I'll say this much. No matter who wins this, I won't be happy. At least on the presidential level, I won't be happy. I think one option is much scarier than the other. I think another Trump administration is not something I'm going to look forward to. It's going to be chaotic, and I'm worried for sure. But we made it through 4 years already, and we can do it again if we have to. Whatever happens, let's just stay calm and just remember that our country's been through a lot. We've survived a lot of things, including Donald Trump. So, yeah, it'll be okay. Okay, I'm going to go now. Happy voting. Talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.